Ancient mummies are discovered in a desert in western China. Their deep eyes, thin lips, and blonde hair amaze Chinese archaeologists because they look European. The discovery of these Caucasian mummies defies history as we know it. Where did they come from? Why did they move into China? And what fate led them to vanish into the desert air? Scientists would journey to the edge of recorded history to pursue the desert mummies of China. Housed in a museum in western China are people whose existence, until now, was impossible to explain. The bodies are so fragile that permission to film them has been denied until this day. As experts conduct routine conservation work, a remote control camera is deployed to film these treasures from every angle. One look at the individual under this shroud reveals a central mystery. His face is Caucasian, yet many centuries ago, he died in China. His remains were discovered in Xinjiang province. Xinjiang is so vast it could swallow France twice. Mountains as high as 5,000 meters spill down to desert depressions 150 meters below sea level. For centuries, Xinjiang's wide-open spaces have attracted mysterious strangers, exotic cultures, and religious beliefs. An Islamic culture called Uyghurs moved into the region from Mongolia in the 8th century AD. Today, they coexist with ethnic Chinese in this land of extremes. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Like a giant furnace, the Taklamakan Desert rests in the Tarim Basin at the base of Xinjiang. In the span of a day, temperatures can soar from -7 to around 50 degrees. The name Taklamakan means, "Go in, and you will not come out." Marco Polo passed through Xinjiang in the 13th century and wrote that the land seemed infested by phantoms. History would prove him right. In the early 20th century, British explorers stumbled upon an enigma. A young man was discovered, enclosed in a crude coffin. His costume was non-Asian. The features of his ancient face seemed European. The team dismissed their discovery as unexplainable. As far as they knew, the earliest interaction between China and the West had nothing to do with mummies and everything to do with silk. In the 2nd century AD, the Chinese created a trade highway called the Silk Road. Caravans laden with silk crossed Xinjiang, protected by a series of fortified outposts. The fabric was destined for the streets of Europe, where it was almost worth its weight in gold. In the 1960s, Chinese archaeologists excavated Silk Road sites. A shocking discovery awaited them. Near a fortress called Gaochang, new mummies emerged. This time, the bodies were Asian. A mysterious process of human preservation was at work in the desert. The footprints of this Asian woman are clear to the naked eye. A clue to her death was the shape of her abdomen.
This body that we're looking at is 1,200 years old. This woman is from the Tang dynasty, and apparently she died in labor. It must have been an agonizing death from the look on her face and her hands. It was amazing seeing this body appearing before our eyes. But then, as our work progressed, we started to find more mummies in other areas of Xinjiang, and they were a lot older.
The discovery of Asian mummies was so encouraging, Wang Binghua was eager to explore other Silk Road sites. The last thing on his mind were the early British reports of Caucasian mummies. The idea that Westerners had lived in ancient China just seemed too fantastic. For now, the discovery and excavation of Silk Road settlements would be difficult enough, especially when the immense area of Xinjiang was considered. The Taklamakan Desert alone covers an area of 325,000 square kilometers. Wang Binghua's monumental survey was brought to the attention of Western archaeologists by Victor Mayer of the University of Pennsylvania.
People obviously couldn't live in the dryness of this desert, this huge desert, but they did live all the way around in these oases between the mountains and the desert.
Oases are born in Xinjiang's mountains. Fields of melting snow feed a network of desert rivers. So vital is every drop of water that a 3,000-kilometer system of underground channels was developed. Called the Carrez, it was built centuries ago to prevent evaporation. The identity of the original designers of this ingenious system is unknown, but ancient peoples must have flocked to river-fed oases like this one in Turpan. Even the smallest clue to Xinjiang's earliest occupation was worth more to Wang Binghua than all the precious waters of the Carrez. From oasis to oasis, villagers were asked if they'd ever heard stories of ancient burials. The professor was advised to look along the rim of the Great Gobi Desert. The most northern desert in the world, the Gobi stretches from southern Mongolia to western China. 1,200,000 square kilometers of hostile terrain. In Xinjiang, it is a treeless, barren expanse. Yet beneath the Gobi's rocky crust, Wang Binghua made the discovery of his life. It happened in Wupu, a pristine desert town forgotten by time. The professor's search for mummies fascinated the local residents. Wang Binghua was welcomed to search for burial sites wherever he pleased. In 1979, on the outskirts of Wupu, Wang's team excavated a shallow depression covered with strange pottery fragments. Layers of ancient logs and thatching were removed. If this was a burial, it was like none they had ever seen. Pottery of unknown origin was discovered. And then they discovered the mummified corpse of a middle-aged man. Many of these early finds were ruined by decay, possibly because their graves were disturbed centuries ago. What mattered were the skulls. The low and wide facial dimensions and strongly projecting nasal openings proved they were Caucasian. Experts now hoped that hidden in these shallow graves were answers to a bottomless mystery. Who were these people? The mummies found in Wupu, China, gave researchers tantalizing hints of European origins. This is Wupu woman, who died at the age of 20. She was the first of a series of well-preserved mummies. This man was buried in Western-style boots, customized for desert wear. Far more telling than the leather pieces were fabrics found near a town called Hami.
I once showed a piece of fabric excavated in Hami to a textile expert in Shanghai, without telling him what it was. He thought it looked like the kind of material Shanghai people used to make pants around 1949. When I told him my fabric piece was over 3,000 years old, he couldn't believe it.
The condition of the fabrics found on the dead revealed a people struggling to survive. For some experts, the mummy fabrics provided a major breakthrough to the possible origins of these nomads. The Urumqi Museum contracted Irene Good and her colleague Elizabeth Barber to examine the fabrics.
When I was first presented with a fragment from Wupu, it just looked like a piece of an old bathrobe that I had from about 15 years ago. It was that well preserved.
Just like detectives use fingerprints, archaeologists identify mysterious cultures by the color and weave of ancient fabrics. Irene Good scanned a color photo of the cloth sample into a computer. The scan enabled her to construct a computer image of how the fabric looked when new. The result was incredible. The cloth was woven in a twill, similar to samples found in Europe dating back 3,000 years.
I was really kind of awestruck. A twill weave is something we're all familiar with. It's the same as in your blue jeans. What intrigued me about this fabric was not only that it's a twill weave, which is characteristically European and not characteristically Chinese, although the Chinese did have the technology for it, was also The coloration, the pattern of color usage on the field of the cloth is what we call plaid, or actually possibly even some kind of a tartan.
The fabric surrendered another extraordinary clue under a scanning electron microscope. Individual wool fibers were magnified hundreds of times. Good compared them to fibers from indigenous Asian sheep.
The type of wool appeared to be of a type that's not known in Western Asia, but in Iron Age Europe.
The ancient Xinjiang fabrics were more than Western in design. They were Western to the very fiber. Encouraged by the early finds, archaeologists wondered if Caucasian burials were widespread throughout Xinjiang. Wang Binghua and his colleagues took a second look at the journals of early explorers. On March the 28th, 1900, a Swedish expedition walked into a Silk Road ghost town called Loulan. The party uncovered tons of antiquities in the ruins, unaware that greater treasures were hidden deeper still. Decades later, Xinjiang archaeologists theorized that humans could have occupied Loulan long before the Silk Road began, in 200 AD. Joined by a Japanese team, they mounted the most ambitious desert expedition in Chinese history. An ancient citadel was excavated, and a strange formation surfaced. Wooden stakes were found arranged in concentric rings. They marked the tomb of 6 male corpses. The most sensational find was yet to come. The body was found wrapped in a coffin of poplar wood. The package looked as though it were buried yesterday. Layer after layer of treated fabric was peeled away. A woman appeared, 144 centimeters tall. She was utterly preserved, along with her wardrobe. Called the Beauty of Loulan, her features were strikingly Caucasian. But the search for mummies was not yet complete. In 1985, Xinjiang's archaeologists moved the search to southeastern Taklamakan. In Chechun County, they struck gold. Several hundred tomb sites were discovered. They found a mummified infant wrapped in purple wool. The eyes were covered in colored stones to keep the lids closed. A second grave was completely undisturbed and provided the most spectacular mummies found to date. The male, nicknamed Chechun Man, must have cut quite a figure when alive. Archaeologists calculated he stood nearly 2 meters tall. Even in death, the features of his face were strong, his blonde eyelashes and beard intact. A female mummy, Chechun Woman, had yellowish-brown hair arranged in 4 braids. The preservation was so complete that the couple seemed more asleep than dead. The sophisticated skills of the mummy culture became obvious through artifacts buried in the graves. This pouch, made of straw, served as a lunchbox. Woven with machine-like precision, the weave was practically airtight. Discoveries of artifacts and bodies showed the Caucasian presence in Western China was widespread. But a profound question remained unanswered. When did these people first enter China? And at what point in history did their struggle to survive in Xinjiang begin? Chinese investigators used a time machine to find out. The process is called carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 is an isotope found in all organic matter. When an organism dies, emissions of carbon-14 decrease at a well-established speed that reveals its age. At the Urumqi Institute of Geology, wood pieces found in the mummy burials were heated to release carbon dioxide gas. The gas was purified and condensed. The samples were placed in a machine to measure the rate of carbon-14 emissions. The moment of truth had come, as computers calculated the ages of the specimens. The dates that confronted Wang Binghua and his colleagues were almost beyond belief. Through carbon dating, the mummies of Xinjiang were forced, at last, to admit their age. Reflected in the faces of the Xinjiang mummies lay a new revelation. This male died in the Gobi 1,200 years ago, about the time Charlemagne became the first Holy Roman Emperor. Earlier still, Churchen Man was buried 3,000 years ago, the period when Troy was destroyed in the Trojan Wars. Wupu woman predates Churchen Man by 2 centuries more. Earlier still, some 3,500 years ago, as the Greeks devised their first alphabet, this child took its last breath in China. The Loulan beauty holds the age record. She was buried 4,000 years ago, about the time of the earliest Egyptian mummies. But one piece of information baffled the experts. How did these ancient people, barely surviving the elements, manage to mummify their dead? Had they employed mummification techniques similar to those of ancient Egyptians? Had this science spread to the remote deserts of Xinjiang? The beauty of Loulan is one of the best preserved mummies of Xinjiang. Because of her condition, archaeologists hope to find both her cause of death and clues to her mummification. An autopsy was performed. Lodged in the mummy's hair were lice. This discovery remains a mystery, since these insects only prey on the living. Loulan Beauty's probable killer was dust and soot found in her lungs, the dust from sandstorms, the soot from cooking fires. The autopsy also revealed that along with her lungs, the woman's intestines and other internal organs were still intact. Egyptian mummification involved the removal of the intestines to prevent decomposition of a corpse. Unlike the Egyptians, the Xinjiang people expected a certain amount of decay. They knew that as the bodies of their dead decomposed, their tongues would swell up, forcing the mouths open. Chin straps prevented this unsightly possibility long enough for the body to be buried. Straps bound the mummy's hands together. In this way, the arms were kept from falling to the side, creating a more dignified pose. If the ancients of Xinjiang were not mummified in the Egyptian style, archaeologists were baffled by what process saved them from decay. At the Wupu dig, the mummies were found resting on mud bricks, the finger marks of the ancient brickmakers still visible. The bricks insulated the mummy from direct contact with the soil. From above, the corpse was protected by a roof of logs, reed matting, and finally soil. The arid desert air circulated freely. In essence, the bodies were freeze-dried.
Under such dryness, bacteria can hardly grow. The natural rotting of the body quickly stops in such dry air, and therefore we have today complete, well-preserved bodies.
Yet, the preservation from region to region was by no means uniform. Some bodies were crumbling skeletons, while others, like Chechen Man, were in mint condition. In search of answers, Wang Binghua and Victor Mayer journeyed over the Tian Shan Mountains to a site called Barlikan Lake. According to legend, a young man ventured to this spot and vanished. The tears of his wife created this magnificent lake. In fact, the composition of Lake Barlikan gets straight to the riddle of the Xinjiang mummies.
A couple 100,000 years ago, this whole area was covered by great ocean, and this high salt content that we see in these few remaining lakes is the residue of what the lakes in the ocean was before. We didn't realize until we looked at all over the province, and we see there are many such salt lakes, and we can find huge salt crystals like this, and this certainly would have had a role in the preservation of the mummies.
It's unlikely the ancients of Xinjiang were aware at first of the natural forces acting on their dead. Like other ancient peoples, they buried the deceased in the ground, unprotected. Over time, bacteria and insects consumed everything but the bones. Months later, the remains were disinterred and moved to a permanent cemetery. But when the ancients of Xinjiang returned to their temporary graves, they discovered something amazing had occurred. Instead of bones, they found many of the bodies were mysteriously preserved. Over the centuries, the magical properties of the desert were enhanced with homespun innovations. Before burial, an ointment, probably made from animal fat, was applied to the corpse. Wherever investigators found it on the mummies, the skin was more supple and better preserved. Something else found on the mummies was far more difficult to explain. Strange symbols in vivid colors gave hints to a secret world of spiritual rites and magical powers. When the graves of the Chechen mummies were uncovered, a gateway to a lost world of ancient beliefs was opened. Some experts believe the emblems were at the center of some form of religion. The ancients may have engaged in sun worship, a faith embraced by early cultures around the world. As forensic studies continued into the Chechen mummies, researchers were astonished by the wounds on this male adult.
They're very clean cuts. They wouldn't have been made by a spear or other weapon, and they're tied up with horsehair sutures. It would seem that this was an attempt to surgically cure some illness that this man was suffering from, probably a lung disease, because there was a lot of lung disease out there from soot and from windborne sand.
In fact, a 3rd century text describes mysterious surgical procedures introduced into China from an unknown foreign land.
It says right here that if a disease is not cured by medicine or acupuncture, that then an incision can be made, the diseased organ can be taken out, washed, cleaned, sewed up, and you're back in business. So surgery did exist in the 3rd century AD, and there's no reason to believe that it might not also have existed in the 3rd or 4th century BC.
According to the ancient text, pain was deadened with a sedative of wine mixed with a morphine-like substance. It's also written that patients began to feel better 4 or 5 days after the procedure, with complete recovery in a month. But the wounds on this individual never healed. Whether he met his end on the operating table is yet to be proved, but the evidence is compelling. A mind-bending scenario was becoming more and more real to Wang Binghua and researchers around the world. 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, Western peoples of unknown origin were not only visiting China, they were living there, praying there, and dying there. More links between China and Europe were found in the 1980s. Nomadic shepherds told researchers of a strange mound that lay at the foot of the Tianshan Mountains.
Oh, look at the size of these stones.
Beneath it were the ruins of a building called Longzhou Wanza. It's the only Bronze Age structure built by Caucasians ever discovered in China. 3,000 years ago, these walls sheltered a people as alien to this region as the Vikings were to Newfoundland. Partial proof of Western habitation was confirmed by this cooking pot in the ruins. It's nearly identical to pots found in Europe. Like a bronze question mark, it challenged archaeologists to dig deeper for answers. Where did the Caucasians come from? How did they travel into China? If Caucasians migrated from the west to China, how could they conquer the high mountain passes that surround Xinjiang? It has been said that humanity began to conquer time and space when it learned to sit firmly on the back of a horse. Today, the horses raised in Xinjiang are considered the finest in all of China. Kazakh shepherds still rely on them. If the ancient Caucasians had domesticated horses, it could help explain how they reached China. Far from the meadows of Xinjiang, anthropologist David Anthony got a tip straight from the horse's mouth. Anthony looked for clues to early Caucasian horseback riding at the base of the Ural Mountains, part of a region language experts call Indo-Europe. Working with Russian archaeologists, he found the skeleton of an ancient horse at a site called Batai. The remains were 5,000 years old.
Just looking at the bones, it's hard to tell whether an ancient horse from an archaeological excavation was eaten for dinner or used in transport in some way. And this is the way we approached it. We decided to study bit wear. Normally when a bit is in a horse's mouth, it sits here, which is on the tongue and on the gums. Now if a horse doesn't like that, it can use its tongue to push the bit back into its teeth in order to keep it from slipping back onto the tongue and the gums. We decided to look at that part of the horse's tooth to see if we could find microscopic scratches, abrasions, traces of the wear made by the horse chewing on the bit. And we did.
The wear on the front edge of the ancient tooth had created a sloping edge, as seen in this diagram. But how could Anthony be sure it was created by a bit?
Now, we wanted to know what kind of bit could have made the wear that we saw on these horses in northern Kazakhstan. So we conducted an experiment at SUNY Kobylskill, a State University of New York campus near here, in which we rode horses that had never been bitted with organic bits, just to see can a bit made of leather or rope create that kind of wear.
Aside from rope, bits made of deer antlers and bone were also used. After weeks of riding, the horses were carefully sedated. Anthony made plaster casts of their teeth to examine the wear marks. The marks produced by the bits were nearly identical to the wear marks on the ancient horse teeth from Batai.
So this establishes that horseback riding began early enough in Eurasia so that the people that were excavated in Xinjiang, the mummies of Xinjiang, could easily have been using horses as transport animals to help get them there, to provide the means of transportation. The earliest of those mummies is about 2000 BC. We have evidence for horseback riding between 3000 and 3500 BC, right out in the middle of Eurasia in the northern grasslands of Kazakhstan.
Two items were discovered in the Xinjiang mummy graves that support this theory. The first, a simple horsewhip. The second, a fragment of a 3,000-year-old wagon wheel. After some 20 years, the circle of clues seemed to be closing. "5,000 years ago, Europeans occupied the western steppes and began raising herds of sheep and domesticating horses. 1,000 years later, a vast herding economy extended from Europe and most likely into northwest China. The evidence of a European migration was impressive, but revolutionary concepts require absolute verification. The only place to find the truth was in the mummy's DNA. The search began half a world away from China, on the Italian island of Sardinia. Paolo Francalacci is a scientist at the University of Sassari, where he specializes in ancient genetic material. Recently, Francalacci embarked on an extraordinary assignment. With the help of Xinjiang experts, he was allowed to extract tissue samples from the mummies. The object was to isolate their 4,000-year-old DNA. DNA is a double twist of molecules that contain the genetic blueprint of every cell in our body. By comparing the DNA of the mummies with modern Asian and European DNA, Francalacci hoped to establish the origins of the mummies of Xinjiang. Tissue was harvested from the unexposed areas of the bodies, usually from the inner thighs or underarms. The biggest concern was contamination. A single skin cell from his own hand could taint the entire study.
Well, the main problem when you analyze ancient human DNA is the authentication of the results, because you know the object and the subject of the study is exactly the same, so a human being. So you won't be sure that you are going to analyze the ancient molecules, not the modern one. I don't want to go there to analyze my DNA, of course. So we must be very careful, and so we must wear gloves, face mask. We must definitely avoid to touch with bare hands the corpses.
25 pieces of tissue from 11 individuals were taken. But due to a bureaucratic problem in China, Francalacci was only allowed to leave with a few samples. Working at the Institute of Molecular Genetics in Sardinia and Stanford University in California, Paolo Francalacci began a painstaking process. Tissue samples were unpacked and ground into cells. DNA was extracted and treated in a special machine that uses precise heat to replicate DNA. Radioactive isotopes were added to the solution. Placed in special gels, the DNA material migrated down hidden channels and formed a pattern. Exposed with ultraviolet light, Francalacci took a snapshot of a human pedigree some 40 centuries old. The DNA patterns of the mummies were compared with living groups of people from China to Europe.
It's possible to say at this point of the research that these people shared with Europeans some common genes. It's very hard for me to be more precise at this point, because I would need more samples for that.
The mummies of Xinjiang are possibly the end players of a migration that shaped our world. Along a grassland highway came prehistoric explorers looking for richer pastures. Ultimately, they crossed the snowy mountain passes into China.
When you look into the face of one of these mummies, you're looking at an individual who played a role in a drama that ultimately united the East with the West. A moment in history when Eurasia was tied together as a single world. And it's a moment that, through the innovations that were developed at that time, has ultimately affected almost all of the people in the world.
The fate of these ancient explorers is the final mystery to be solved. Based on the human remains discovered, the last of the Caucasoid mummies lived 2,500 years ago. This leaves the question, what happened to these people? As the mummy excavations continued, the remains of Asians were discovered buried side by side with Caucasians, all from the same period.
They seem to have gotten along very well and even intermarried. And it's interesting to observe that they were buried in the same grave sometimes. I think this is a good indication that people can get along together, even 3,000 years ago.
We can only imagine the moment when East met West, at the emotions that flowed from one side to the other. Perhaps both peoples looked beyond the shape of an eye or the cut of their cloth, and recognized something incredible had happened. That beyond the grasslands and deserts that once seemed so endless, they were not alone. Mixed by time, the threads of blood and family, East and West, merged and disappeared into the fabric of China itself.